Change is the only constant. Change is the only constant. Okay, I was just checking if the audio was audio is working fine or no, and it is indeed working fine. So now it's time to start. So yeah, change is the only constant. Why I said that? So earlier मैं पहले ऐसे सोचता था ना. Earlier I used to think in this manner that perfection should be there, and until and unless the situation and everything is not perfect, I should not start in the first place. So that was my general thinking earlier on. But now the more I'm reading things, the more I'm getting more perspective. So I get to know that perfection itself is a myth. You have to start somewhere, and once you'll start somewhere in the journey, you'll improve things and you'll be better than before, and it'll keep on happening the same way, right? तो इसी पर्सपेक्टिव के साथ मैंने बुक्स को पढ़ना स्टार्ट किया. लाइक दिस इज़ वाई आई एम रीडिंग बुक्स टू गेट न्यू पर्सपेक्टिव and to improve for the betterment. And here I am reading this book, that is Men's Search for Meaning. एंड अभी हम इसके पेज नंबर 61 पे. विक्टर फ्रैंकल के द्वारा लिखी हुई बुक है. बहुत अच्छी बुक है. अभी तक जितनी मैंने पढ़ी है बहुत अच्छी बुक है. अभी तो हम एक्सपीरियंस वाले पार्ट में ही है, मेन पार्ट में तो अभी हम पहुँचे ही नहीं है. तो स्टिल इट इज़ अ वेरी गुड बुक. आई हैव read about reviews related to this book, and reviews tells us that it is a very good book. Like something, there will be something that you can take out from this book. So it is one of those kind of book. All right, it gives you a new perspective. All you have to do is just be open about it. Whenever, all right, let's begin. Whenever the degraded majority and the promoted minority came into conflict, and there were plenty of opportunities for this. Starting with the distribution of food, the results were explosive. Therefore, the general irritability, whose physical causes were discussed above, became most intense when these mental tensions were added. It is not surprising that this tension often ended in a general fight. Since the prisoners continually witnessed scenes of beatings, the impulse towards violence was increased. I myself first felt my fist clench when anger came over me while I was famished and tired. I was usually very tired since we had to stoke our stove, which we were allowed to keep in our hut for the typhus patients throughout the nights. However, some of the most idyllic hours I have ever spent were in the middle of the night when all the others were delirious or sleeping. I could lie stretched out in front of the stove and roast a few pilfered pilfered potatoes in a fire made from stolen charcoal. But the following day, I always felt even more tired, insensitive, and irritable. While I was working as a doctor in the typist block, I also had to take the to place of the senior block warden who was ill. Therefore, I was responsible to the camp authority for keeping the hut clean. If clean can be used to describe such a condition, the pretense at inspection to which the hut was frequently submitted was more for the purpose of torture than of hygiene. More food and few drugs would have helped, but the only concern of the inspectors was whether a piece of straw was left in the center corridor, or whether the dirty, ragged, and verminous blankets of the patients were tucked in neatly at their feet. As to the fate of the inmates, they were quite unconcerned. If I reported smartly, whipping my prison cap from Sean head and clicking my heels, hut number VI, 6 by 9, 52, okay, patients, two nursing orderlies, and one doctor. They were satisfied, and then they would leave. But until they arrived, often they were hours later than announced, and sometimes did not come at all. I was forced to keep strengthening blankets, picking up bits of straws which fell from the bunks, and shouting at the poor devils who tossed in their beds and threatened to upset all my efforts at tidiness and cleanliness. Apathy was particularly increased among the feverish patients, so that they did not react at all unless they were shouted at. Even this fallen at times, even this failed at times, and then it took tremendous self control not to strike them. For one's own irritability took on enormous proportions in the face of the other's apathy and especially in the face of the danger. Therefore, the approaching inspection, which was caused by it. In attempting this psychological presentation and a psychopathological explanation of the typical characteristics of a concentration camp inmate, I may give the impression that the human being is completely and unavoidably influenced by his surrounding. That is true. We also say, no, you will become the person or the average of the five-person you hang out with. So that's how it works. In this case, the surroundings being the unique structure of camp life, which forced the prisoner to conform his conduct to a certain set pattern. But what about human liberty? Is there no spiritual freedom in regard to behavior and action to any uh, given surroundings? Is that theory true, which would have us believe that man is no more than a product of many conditional and environmental factors, be they of biological, psychological, or sociological nature? Is man but an accidental product of these? Most important, do the prisoner's reaction to the singular word of the concentration camp prove that man cannot escape the influence of his surroundings? Does man have no choice of action in the face of such circumstances? We can answer these questions from experiences as well as on principle. The experiences of camp life show that man does have a choice of action. There were enough examples, often of a heroic nature, which proved that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible condition of psychic and physical stress. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the man who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And now this is very important. So everything can be snatched away from a human being except the freedom of its mind to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances and to choose one's own way. तभी आप देखते होगे कि लाइक बहुत सारी डिफरेंट मतलब एक सेम कंडीशन में अगर आप अलग अलग पर्सन को डालोगे तो वो अलग अलग तरीके से बिहेव करेंगे बिकॉज देयर एटीट्यूड इज डिफरेंट टू वॉट द सर्कमस्टेंसेज. Alright, and this is the freedom. This is something that is making us different from one another. Alright, and there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of the typical inmate. Seen from this point of view, the mental reactions of the inmates of a concentration camp must seem more to us than the mere expression of certain physical and sociological conditions. Even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways. In the final analysis, it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision and not the result of camp influences alone. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him mentally and spiritually. I want to go through it once again. Now, this is very important. Seen from this point of view, the mental reactions of the inmates of a concentration camp must seem more to us when the mere expression of certain physical and sociological conditions. Even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways. In the final analysis, it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision, all right, not the circumstances, right, and not the result of camp influences alone. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him mentally and spiritually. We may retain his human dignity even in concentration camp. He may remain his human dignity even in concentration camp. Dostoevsky said once, "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." These words frequently came to my mind after I became acquainted with those martyrs whose behavior in camp, whose suffering and death bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. It can be said that they were worthy of their sufferings. The way they bore their sufferings was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. An active life serves the purpose of giving man the opportunity to realize values in creative work, while a passive life of enjoyment affords him the opportunity to obtain fulfillment in experiencing beauty, art, or nature. But there is also purpose in that life which is almost barren of both creation and enjoyment, and which admits of but one possibility of high moral behavior, namely in man's attitude of to his existence, an existence restricted by external forces. A creative life and a life of enjoyment are banned to him. But not only creativeness and enjoyment are meaningful. If there is a meaning in life at all, there must be a meaning in suffering. There must be a meaning in suffering too. Generally, we question the suffering, right? Why it happened with us, why I am unlucky, why it is coming my way. So, we need to change our perspective that there is this, if I'm right, so this is from the movie Joker. It, it goes as, like the quote goes as, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And in movie Joker, it is like retermed as, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So whatever the sufferings are, it is somewhat helping you to grow in your life. So it is all about perspective, right? So rather than just giving up, you need to take the responsibility of your life, and you need to understand that okay, this is not the end. There is a silver lining somewhere. You have to look for the betterment, and any which ways, when you will be out of this situation, this particular dreadful situation, you'll be better person in comparison to what when you entered in this that situation, right? So whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Suffering is an incredible, ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. So these are the kind of things that will happen in everyone's life, no matter what the circumstances is, no matter how much money he or she has. Suffering and fate and death will be there in everyone's life. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. So these are like very important part of human life: suffering, death, and there is another thing which is suffering and death, all right. Fate is also there. The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives his ample opportunity gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add deeper meaning to his life. It may remain brave, dignified, and unselfish, or in the bitter fight or self preservation, he may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. Here lies the chance for man either to make use of or to forego the opportunity of attaining the moral values that a difficult situation may afford him. And this decides whether he is worthy of his suffering or not. Do not think that these considerations are unworldly and too far removed from real life. It is true that only a few people are capable of reaching such high moral standards. Of the prisoners, only a few kept their full inner liberty and obtained these values which their suffering afforded. But even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. Inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. Such men are not only in concentration camps, everywhere man is confronted with fate, with the chance of achieving something through his own suffering. Take the fate of the sick, especially those who are incurable. I once read a letter written by a young invalid in which he told a friend that he had just found out he would not live for long, that even an operation would be of no help. He wrote further that he remembered a film he had seen in which a man was portrayed who waited for death in a courageous and dignified way. The boy had thought it a great accomplishment to meet that so well. Now he wrote, fate was offering him a similar chance. Those of us who saw the film called Resurrection, taken from a book by Tolstoy years ago, may have had similar thoughts. Here were great destinies and great men. For us at that time, there were no great fate. There was no chance to achieve such greatness. After this picture, we went to the nearest cafe, and over a cup of coffee and a sandwich, we forgot the strange metaphysical thoughts which for one moment had crossed our minds. But when we ourselves were confronted with a great destiny and faced with the decision of meeting it with equal spiritual greatness, by then we had forgotten our youthful resolutions of long ago, and we failed. Perhaps there came a day for some of us when we saw the same film again, or a similar one, but by then other pictures may have simultaneously unrolled before our one's inner eye. Pictures of people who attained much more in their lives than a sentimental film could show. Some details of a particular man's inner greatness may have come to one's mind, like the story of the young woman whose death I witnessed in a concentration camp. It is a simple story, there is little to tell, and it may sound as if I had invented it, but to me it seems like a poem. This young woman knew that she would die in the next few days, but when I talked to her, she was cheerful in spite of this knowledge. I am grateful that fate had hit me so hard. She told me, in my former life, I was spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously. Pointing through the window of the hut, she said, this tree here is the only friend I have in my loneliness. Through that window, she could see just one branch of a chestnut tree, and on the branch there were two blossoms. I often talk to this tree, she said to me. I was startled and didn't quite know how to take her words. Was she delirious? Did she have occasional hallucination? Anxiously, I asked her if the tree replied, yes. What did it say to her? She answered, it said to me, I am here, I am here, I am life, eternal life. We have stated that which was ultimately responsible for the state of the prisoner's inner self and not so much the enumerated psychological causes as it was the result of a free decision. Psychological observation of the prisoners have shown that only the men who allowed their inner hold on their more moral and spiritual selves to subside eventually fell victim to the camp's degenerating influences. The questions now arises, what could or should have constituted this inner hold? Former prisoners, when writing or relating their experiences, agree that the most depressing influence of all was that a prisoner could not know how long his term of imprisonment would be. He had been no date for his release. In our camp, it was pointless even to talk about it. Actually, a prisoner term was not only uncertain but unlimited. A well known research psychologist had pointed out that life in a concentration camp could be called a provisional existence. We can add to this by defining it as a provisional existence of unknown limit. New arrivals usually knew nothing about the conditions at a camp. Those who had come back from other camps were obliged to keep silent, and from some camps no one had returned. On entering camp, a change took place in the minds of the men. With the end of uncertainty, they, there came the uncertainty of the end. It was impossible for foresee it was impossible to foresee whether or when, if at all, this form of existence would end. The Latin word finish has two meanings: the end of the finish, the end or the finish, and a goal to reach. A man who could not see the end of his provisional existence was not able to aim at an ultimate goal in life. He sees living for the future in contrast to a man in normal life. Therefore, the whole structure of his inner life changed. Signs of decay set in, which we know from other areas of life. The unemployed worker, for example, is in a similar position. His existence has become provisional, and in certain sense, he cannot live for the future or aim at a goal. Research work done on unemployed minors has shown that they suffer from a peculiar sort of deformed time, inner time, which is a result of their unemployed state. Prisoners too suffered from this strange time experience. In camp, a small time unit a day, for example, filled with hourly torture and fatigue, appeared endless. A larger time unit, perhaps a week, seemed to pass very quickly. My comrades agreed when I said that in camp a day lasted longer than a week. How paradoxical was our time experience? In this connection, we are reminded of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which contains some very pointed psychological remarks. Mann studies the spiritual development of people who are in analogous psychological position. Therefore, tuberculosis patient in sanatorium who also know no date for their release. They experience a similar existence without a future and without a goal. और ऐसा होता है कभी भी आप अपने ऐसी एक्टिविटी करते हो जिसमें आपको मज़ा आ रहा है, मतलब जिसमें आपका जेन्युइनली इंटरेस्ट है, तो आपको पता ही नहीं चलता है कि टाइम कितनी जल्दी चलेगा। और कभी आप ऐसी एक्टिविटी करते हो जिसमें आपका इंटरेस्ट है नहीं, जैसे आजकल बहुत कॉमन है कि पढ़ाई में जनरली बहुत रेयर ही कोई होता है जिसको मतलब पढ़ाई में इंटरेस्ट हो। अदरवाइज जनरली जैसे पढ़ाई में किसी का इंटरेस्ट नहीं है तो आपको लगता है कि यार ये बहुत ज़्यादा लंबा टाइम, आपको लगता है जैसे 1 घंटा पढ़ने के लिए बैठते हो तो आपको वो 1 घंटा भी बहुत लंबा टाइम लगता है। एंड it is because of the same reason, right? Time is same, it is your own meaning that you are putting in the time, the own interest that you are showing towards the activity that you are doing, which is making you feel the time is less or time is more. Similar situation happened to these people as well. One of the prisoners who on his arrival marched with a long column of new inmates from the station of the camp told me later that he had felt as though he were marching at his own funeral. His life had seemed to him absolutely without future. He regarded it as over and done, as if he had already died. This feeling of lifelessness and intensified by other causes in time, it was the lifelessness of the term of imprisonment which was most acutely felt. In space, the narrow limits of the prison. Anything outside the barbed wire became remote, out of reach, and in a way unreal. The events and the people outside all the normal life there had a ghostly aspect of the prisoner. The outside life, that is, as much as he could see of it, appeared to him almost as it might have to a dead man who looked at it from another world. A man who let himself decline because he could not see any future goal found himself occupied with retrospective thoughts. In a different connection, we have already spoken of the tendency there was to look into the past, to help make the present, with all its horrors, less real. But in robbing the present of its reality, there lay a certain danger. It became easy to overlook the opportunities to make something positive of camp life, opportunities which really did exist regarding our provisional existence, as unreal was in itself an important factor in causing the prisoners to lose their hold on fire or hold on life. Everything in way became pointless. Such people forgot that often it is just such an exceptionally difficult external situation which gives man the opportunity to grow spiritually beyond himself. Instead of taking the camp's difficulty as a test of their inner strength, they did not take their life seriously and despised it as something of no consequence. They preferred to close their eyes and to live in the past. Life for such people became meaningless. Someone who is living in past or future, to be very precise. Naturally, only a few people were capable of teaching great spiritual heights, but a few were given the chance to attain human greatness, even though their apparent worldly failure and death, an accomplishment which in ordinary circumstances they would never have achieved. To the others of us, the mediocre and the half-hearted, the word of Bismarck could be applied. Life is like being at the dentist. You always think that the worst is still to come, and yet it is over already. Wearing this, we could say that most men in concentration camp believed that the real opportunities of life had passed. Yet in reality, there was an opportunity and a challenge. One could make a victory of those experiences, turning life into an inner triumph. Or one could ignore the challenge and simply vegetate, as did a majority of the prisoners. Any attempt at fighting the camp's pathological influence on the prisoners by psychotherapeutic or psychohygienic methods had to aim at given him inner strength by pointing out to him a future goal to which he could look forward. Instinctively, some of the prisoners attempted to find one of their own. It is peculiarly of a man that he can only live by looking to the future. Subspecies, or it is some other language. A term mitis, okay. And this is his salvation. In the most difficult moments of his existence, although he sometimes has to force his mind to the task. I remember a personal experience. Almost in 10 years from pain, I had terrible sores on my feet from wearing torn shoes. I limped a few kilometers with our long column of men from the camp to our work site. Very cold, bitter wind struck us. I kept thinking of the endless little problems of our miserable life. What would there be to eat tonight? If a piece of sausage came uh, as extra ration, should I exchange it for a piece of bread? Should I trade my last cigarette, which was left from a bonus I received a fortnight ago, for a bowl of soup? How could I get a piece of wire to replace the fragment which served as one of my shoelaces? Would I get to our work site in time to join my usual working party, or would I have to join another, which might have a brutal foreman? What could I do to get on good terms with the capo, who could help me to obtain work in camp instead of undertaking the horribly long daily march? I became disgusted with the state of affairs which compelled me, daily and hourly, to think of only such trivial things. I forced my thoughts to turn to another subject. Suddenly, I saw myself standing on the platform of a well lit, warm, and pleasant lecture room. In front of me sat an attentive audience on comfortable, upholstered seats. I was giving a lecture on the psychology of the concentration camp. All that oppressed me at the moment became objective, seen and described from the remote viewpoint of science. By this method, I succeeded somehow in rising above the situation, above the sufferings of the moment, and I observed them as if they were already of the past. Both I and my troubles became the object of an interesting psychoscientific study undertaken by myself. What does Spinoza say in his Ethics? Affectus qui passio. Okay, there's some other language. We'll just skip it. Emotions, which is suffering, ceases to be suffering as soon as we from a clear and precise picture of it. Okay, so basically, if you can see the end goal, the suffering will end, or you will get the tolerance level to go through that particular suffering, is what author is trying to say over here. The prisoner who had lost faith in the future, his future was doomed. With his loss of belief in the future, he also lost his spiritual hold. He let himself decline and became subject to mental and physical decay. Usually, this happened quite suddenly, in the form of a crisis, the symptoms of which were similar or familiar to the experience camp inmate. We all feared this moment, not for ourselves, which would have been pointless, but for our friends. Usually, it began with the prisoner refusing one morning to get dressed and wash or to go out on the parade ground. No entreaties, no blows, no threats had any effect. He just lay there, hardly moving. If this crisis was brought about by an illness, he refused to be taken to the sick bay or to do anything to help himself. He simply gave up. There he remained lying in his own etc. excreta, and nothing bothered him anymore. I once had a dramatic demonstration of the close link between the loss of faith in the future and this dangerous giving up. F, my senior block warden, a fairly well known composer and librettist, confided in me one day. I would like to tell you something, doctor. I have had a strange dream. A voice told me that I could wish for something, that I should only say what I wanted to know, and all my questions would be answered. What do you think? I asked. That I would like to know when the war would be over for me. You know what I mean, doctor, for me. I wanted to know when our camp would be liberated and our sufferings come to an end. And when did you have this dream? I asked. In February 1945, he answered. It was then the beginning of the march. What did you dream? Voice answer. Furtively, he whispered to me, March 30th. Okay. When F told me about his dream, he was still full of hope and convinced that the voice of his dream would be right. But as the promised day drew nearer, the war news which reached our camp made it appear very unlikely that we would be free on the promised date. On March 29th, F suddenly became ill and ran a high temperature. On March 30th, the day his prophecy had told him that the war and suffering would be over for him, he became delirious and lost consciousness. On March 31st, he was dead. To all outward appearances, he had died of typhus. Those who know how close the connection is between the state of mind of a man, his courage and hope or lack of them, and the state of immunity of his body will understand that the sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect. The ultimate cause of any friend's death was that the ultimate cause of my friend's death was that the unexpected liberation did not come and he was severely disappointed. This suddenly lowered his body's resistance against the latent typhus infection. His fate in the future and he'll to live had become paralyzed and his body fell victim to illness. And thus the voice of his dream was right after all. Okay, just give me 1 second. All right. So sorry for the inconvenience caused. Actually, I got a call and it was kind of important call, so I have to look into it. That's why I have to turn off my camera and also the voice. All right, let's move back. So we were talking about, yes, those who know how close the connection. Okay. Those who know how close the connection is between the state of mind of a man, his courage and hope, or lack of them, and the state of immunity of his body will understand that the sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect. जो हिंदी में बोलते हैं ना, मन के हारे हार है, मन के जीते जीत, वही वाला कि अगर if you'll just give up from inside, then the situation in the external environment will also make you go further down. But if you haven't give up from the inside, you'll find some hope in the outside world. You'll get through it, like you'll have the opportunity to get through it, and whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That is the general philosophy that we follow, right? Now this suddenly lowered, all right, where were we? The ultimate cause of my friend's death was that uh, the expected liberation did not come and he was severely disappointed. तो जैसे वो बता रहे हैं कि उनका एक फ्रेंड था जिसने सोचा था कि मार्च 30th और सम डेट, हाँ शायद मार्च 30th को उनको इस चीज़ से आज़ादी मिल जाएगी, लाइक वो जो कंसंट्रेशन कैंप है उससे बाहर आ जाएंगे, ऐसा कुछ उसको ड्रीम आया था। तो उसने अपने सारे स्टेक्स इस पे रखे हुए थे कि मार्च 30th को उसको आज़ादी मिल जाएगी या वो यहाँ से इस कंडीशन से, इस एडवर्स कंडीशन से बाहर हो जाएंगे। पर ऐसा होता नहीं है। तो मार्च 30th जैसे ही आता है चीज़ें उसके अकॉर्डिंग नहीं होती हैं, तो उसके मतलब वो अंदर से फिर गिव अप कर देता है, जिसके कारण उसकी बॉडी पे भी नेगेटिव इम्पैक्ट दिखता है और मार्च 31st को ही उसकी डेथ हो जाती है। तो इतना वो डिसअपॉइंटेड हो जाता है। तो इसलिए बोल रहे हैं कि आपकी इनर विल और आपकी जो हेल्थ है उसके बीच में कनेक्शन होता है। इनर विल आपकी अगर स्ट्रांग है तो आपकी बॉडी भी फाइट करेगी जो भी इलनेस है या जो भी एक्सटर्नल इन्वायरमेंट है उसमें, लेकिन अगर आपने अंदर से हार मान ली तो फिर तो देर विल बी नो कमिंग बैक। ऑलराइट, that's what author is saying, and that's something that I also think is kind of correct. The ultimate cause of my friend's death was that the expected liberation did not come and he was severely disappointed. This suddenly lowered his body's resistance against the latent typhus infection. His faith in the future and his will to live had become paralyzed, and his body fell victim to illness. And thus, the voice of his dream was right after all. So, एक तरीके से indirectly आज़ादी मिल गई, right? The observations of this one case and the conclusions drawn from them are in accordance with something that was drawn to my attention by the chief doctor of our concentration camp. The death rate in the week between Christmas 1994 and New Year's 1945 increased in camp beyond all previous experiences. In his opinion, the explanation for this increase did not lie in the harder working conditions or the deterioration of our food supplies or a change of weather or new epidemics. It was simply that the majority of the prisoners had lived in the naive hope that they would be home again by Christmas. As the time drew nearer and there was no encouraging news, the prisoners lost courage and disappointment overcame them. This had a dangerous influence on their powers of resistance, and a great number of them died. As we said before, any attempt to restore a man's any okay, where were we? As we said before, any attempt to restore a man's inner strength in the camp had first to succeed. All right. What? क्यों मेरे को इतने पॉपअप्स आ रहे हैं भाई, कैसे बंद होंगे? As we said before, any attempt to restore a man's inner strength in the camp had first to succeed in. अरे भाई. As we said before, any attempt to restore a man's inner strength in the camp had first to succeed in showing him some future goal. Nietzsche's words: "He who has a why to live for, can bear with almost anyhow. He who has a why to live for can bear with almost anyhow." could be the guiding motto for all psychotherapeutic and psychohygienic efforts regarding prisoners. Whether there was an opportunity for it, one had to give them a why, an aim for their lives, in order to strengthen them to bear this terrible how of their existence. Woe to him who saw no more sense in his life, no aim, no purpose, and therefore no point to carrying on. He was soon lost. The typical reply with which such a man rejected all encouraging arguments was, I have nothing to expect from life anymore. What sort of answer can one give to that? What was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. We had to learn ourselves, and furthermore, we had to teach the despairing men that it did not really matter what we expect from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking what the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation but in right action and in right conduct. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the task which it constantly sets for each individuals. These tasks and therefore the meaning of life differ from man to man and from moment to moment. Thus, it is impossible to define the meaning of life in general way. Questions about the meaning of life can never be answered by sweeping statements. Life does not mean something vague, but something very real and concrete, just as life's tasks are also very real and concrete. They form man's destiny, which is different and unique for each individual. No man and no destiny can be compared with any other man or any other destiny. No situation repeat itself, and each situation calls for a different response. Sometimes the situation in which a man finds himself may require him to shape his own fate by action. At other times, At other times, it is more advantageous for him to make use of an opportunity for contemplation and to realize assets in this way. Sometimes man may be required simply to accept fate, to bear his cross. Every situation is distinguished by its uniqueness, and there is always one right answer to the problem posed by the situation at hand. When a man finds that it is his destiny to suffer, he will have to accept his suffering as his task, his single and unique task. He'll have to acknowledge the fact that even in suffering, he is unique and alone in the universe. No one can relieve him of his suffering. No one can relieve him of his suffering or suffer in his place. His unique opportunity lies in the way in which he bears his burden. For us as prisoners, these thoughts were not speculations far removed from reality. They were the only thoughts that could be of help to us. They kept us from despair, even when there seemed to be no chance of coming out of it alive. Long ago, we had passed the stage of asking what was the meaning of life, a naive query which understands life as the attaining of some aim through the active creation of something of value. For us, the meaning of life embraced the wider circles of life and death, of suffering and of dying. Let me go through it once again. This is important. For us, as prisoners, these thoughts were not of speculation, not speculation far removed from reality. They were the only thoughts that could be of help to us. They kept us from despair, even when there seemed to be no chance of coming out of it alive. Long ago, we had passed the stage of asking what was the meaning of life, a naive query which understands life as the attaining of some aim through the active creation of something of value. For us, the meaning of life embraced the wider cycles of life and death, of suffering and of dying. Once the meaning of suffering had been revealed to us, we refused to minimize or alleviate the camp's tortures by ignoring them or harboring false illusions and entertaining artificial optimism. Suffering had become a task on which we did not want to turn our backs. We had realized its hidden opportunities for achievement, the opportunities which caused the poet are like to write. Okay, all right. How much suffering there is to get through. I like spoke of getting through suffering, as others would talk of getting through work. There was plenty of suffering for us to get through. Therefore, it was necessary to face up to the full amount of suffering, trying to keep moments of weakness and furtive tears to a minimum. But there was no need to be ashamed of tears, for tears bore witness that a man had the greatest of courage, the courage to suffer. Only very few realized that. Same, Same-facedly, some confessed occasionally that they had wept, like the comrade who answered my question of how he had gotten over his edema by confessing, I have wept it out of my system. The tender beginnings of a psychotherapy or psychohygiene were when they were possible at all in the camp, either individual or collective in nature. The individual therapeutic attempts were often a kind of life saving procedure. These efforts were usually concerned with the prevention of suicides. A very strict camp ruling forbade any efforts to save a man who attempted suicide. It was forbidden, for example, to cut down a man who was trying to hang himself. Therefore, it was all important to prevent these attempts from occurring. I remember two cases of would be suicide, which bore a striking similarity to each other. Both men had talked to their intentions to commit suicide. Both used the typical argument they had nothing more to expect from life. In both cases, it was a question of getting them to realize that life was still expecting something from them. देखो यहाँ पे पर्सपेक्टिव ही चेंज हो जा रहा है. जैसे हम सोचते हैं कि लाइफ का कोई तो मीनिंग होगा, लाइफ हमको एक मीनिंग बताएगी और फिर हम उसके अकॉर्डिंग काम करेंगे, पर यहाँ पे उल्टा हो रहा है. इसमें बोल रहा है कि लाइफ आपसे कुछ एक्सपेक्ट करती है. आप लाइफ से कुछ एक्सपेक्ट मत करो, लाइफ आपसे एक्सपेक्ट करती है टू फाइंड आउट द आंसर, टू वर्क इन अ सिमिलर मैनर, टू वर्क इन अ सर्टेन मैनर. जैसे वो मूवी में था ना, कौन सी मूवी थी वो, तमाशा मूवी में था, जो रणवीर कपूर होता है मेन कैरेक्टर, प्रोटैगनिस्ट जो होता है, वो जाता है और वहाँ जाके फिर वो एक संत टाइप होता है या सूफी टाइप जो भी होता है उनके पास जाता है और उनसे पूछता है कि मेरी कहानी आगे को बताओगे क्या होगा. तो वो उसको डांटते हैं, मतलब उससे बोलता है कायर बुजदिल, मेरे से जानना चाहता है अपनी कहानी, तू बता अपनी कहानी. तो वैसे ही है कि लाइफ आपसे पूछ रही है दैट व्हाट इज़ यू ट्राइंग टू डू, व्हाट इज़ योर वाई, लाइक तुम्हारा क्या है वाई जिसके कारण तुम लाइफ में आगे जाओगे. लाइफ एक्सपेक्ट फ्रॉम यू. In both cases, it was a question of getting them to realize that life was still expecting something from them. Something in the future was expected of them. We found, in fact, that for the one, it was his child whom he adored and who was waiting for him in a foreign country. For the other, it was a thing, not a person. This man was a scientist and had written a series of books which still needed to be finished. तो उन दोनों के पास अपने अपने रीजंस थे जिसके कारण उनको सर्वाइव करने की ज़रूरत है. किसी के लिए वो उनका बच्चा था या चाइल्ड था, किसी के लिए एक साइंटिस्ट के लिए उसका अनफिनिश्ड वर्क था जो उसको अभी भी सर्वाइव करने के लिए, आप बोल सकते हो कि विच वॉन्ट्स टू सर्वाइव, like which make the person wants to survive. His work could not be done by anyone else any more than another person could ever take the place of the father in his child's affections. This uniqueness and singleness, which distinguishes each individual and gives a meaning to his existence, has a bearing on creative work as much as it does on human love. When the impossibility of replacing a person is realized, it allows the responsibility which a man has for his existence and its continuance to appear in all its magnitude. A man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears towards a human being who affectionately waits for him or to an unfinished work will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence and will be able to bear almost any how. The opportunity the opportunities for collective psychotherapy were naturally limited in camp. The right example was more effective than words could ever be. A senior block warden who did not side with the authorities had, by his just and encouraging behavior, a thousand opportunities to exert a far reaching moral influence on those under his jurisdiction. The immediate influence of behavior is always more effective than that of words. But at times a word was effective too. When men, when mental receptiveness had been intensified by some outer circumstances. I remember an incident when there was occasion for psychotherapeutic work on the inmates for a whole hut due to an intensification of their receptiveness because of a certain external situation. It had been a bad day. On parade, an announcement had been made about the many actions that would, from then on, be regarded as sabotage and therefore punishable by immediate death by hanging. Among these were crimes such as cutting small strips from our old blankets in order to improvise ankle supports, and very minor thefts. A few days previously, a semi starved prisoner had broken into the potato store to steal a few pounds of potatoes. The theft had been discovered, and some prisoners had recognized the burglar. When the camp authorities heard about it, they ordered that the guilty man be given up to them, for the whole camp would starve for a day. Naturally, the 2,500 men preferred to fast. Huh. On the evening of this day of fasting, we lay in our earthen huts in a very low mood. Very little was said, and every word sounded irritable. Then, to make matters even worse, the light went out. Tempers reached their lowest ebb. But our senior block warden was a wise man. He improvised a little talk about all that was on our minds at that moment. He talked about the many comrades who had died in the last few days, either of sickness or of suicide. But he also mentioned that what may have been the real reason for their deaths, giving up hope. He maintained that there should be some way of preventing possible future victims from reaching this extreme state. And it was to me that the warden pointed to give this advice. God knows I was not in the mood to give psychological explanations or to preach any sermons to offer my comrades a kind of medical care of their souls. I was cold and hungry, irritable and tired, but I had to make the effort and use this unique opportunity. Encouragement was now more necessary than ever. ठीक है, अभी हम पहुंचे पेज नंबर 75 आउट ऑफ 148 और ऑलमोस्ट हमने आधी बुक कवर कर ली है मैन सर्च फॉर मीनिंग. अभी हम एक्सपीरियंस वाले पार्ट में ही है. लोगोथेरेपी इसका नेक्स्ट चैप्टर है. तो नेक्स्ट लाइव में हम कंटिन्यू करेंगे पेज नंबर 75 से. सो आप यहाँ पर अभी तक जो भी आए हो, अगर आपका इंटरेस्ट है तो यू कैन सब्सक्राइब टू द चैनल. इंटरेस्ट अगर बुक रीडिंग वगैरह इन सारी चीज़ों में है. एंड थैंक यू सो मच फॉर बीइंग हियर. थैंक यू सो मच इन यूर्स. थैंक यू सो मच राधा रानी जी. हैव फन.